dated to around 4000 BC. The symbolism will continue in the later times, especially in the Minoan culture, where we have many bull heads, bulls, and so-called sacred horns. The symbol of sacred horns begins much earlier than in Crete. Actually, it begins in Çatalhuyuk or even earlier in the 7th millennium or before. And here are some examples from the Çatalhuyuk shrine, where 3 bull heads are portrayed on one wall of the shrine with a labyrinthine design on top. And then below there are hands. And hands probably were symbols of the goddess's hands. Her presence or her power was there. And the bulls were here for regeneration. Then there are vases decorated with bull heads, and the design usually is a whirling pattern, snakes, S-shaped spirals turning around. So these are enhancing, stimulating life powers. The bull head usually appears at the entrance of tombs. Here are examples from Sardinia, where above the entrance there is a bull head in relief, and then inside the design on the walls of the inside of the tomb, this is a subterranean tomb, also bull horns. Sometimes they appear in 2, in 3s, many, maybe 10 of them are found in one tomb. And I shall finish now with the Minoan sacred horns, which are celebrated symbols, are very well known. And who is now coming up here? Who is in the middle between the horns? In literature, you can find a description that this is a symbol of a double X. Well, it is not a big mistake, but I could also call this a butterfly. But the X was also a symbol of the goddess, because the X was triangular, and X's are portrayed throughout as symbols of the goddess. And if you have the image of the goddess of regeneration in the shape of an hourglass, you turn it sideways, horizontally, you have a butterfly. And she was a butterfly, and she was a woman, and she was an axe. And then also double axe. But later on, in the 2nd millennium, when the Indo-Europeans arrived in Crete, well, then probably this symbol was transformed into an axe, a double axe. And there are still several slides left to indicate what is portrayed on sarcophagi of Crete from around the 14th, 13th centuries BC. Still the same symbolism continues. This is life-enhancing, actually. Shells and horns and butterflies growing from the head of a bull, and flowers. So it is quite logical that you portray something on a sarcophagus which enhances life and promotes regeneration. But sometimes this so-called double X is for sure a butterfly. And this is an example from a seal from Zakros, which is eastern Crete. And this is a clear goddess with the wings of a butterfly. And this is an eyed butterfly But the goddess, well, she is a woman, she has a crown, but her legs are not human. Maybe she has bull legs, maybe another animal, but probably bull or vultures. Difficult to decide. And then in my last slide, I shall show you that she can be also a bull. The goddess can be a bull. This one has a head, which is a vulture's head, with enormous horns, and then there are crescents next to that. So here we have a combination of symbols which we already have seen before. The bull or the bull head is the uterus. The vulture is the symbol of goddess of death and regeneration. And then we have crescents, of course, and horns, which are also symbols of regeneration. Definitely the symbols of regeneration predominate throughout. Now I'm willing to answer your questions if you have any.
Could you say something about what happened to the old goddess culture? What was the takeover by the Indo-Europeans? How did that come about? And what were the changes that occurred?
My hypothesis is that the old European culture was partially destroyed by the invaders from the east. I call them the Kurgan people, the horse-riding warriors. They started in the Volga region of South Russia. Their culture, about the same time when the old European culture was flourishing, their culture was also already food-producing, pastoral and agricultural, but of a very different type. They were cattle breeders, and they have domesticated the horse sometime in the 6th millennium, or maybe even earlier. We don't know that. But then, in the 5th millennium, they were very mobile because of the horse. And they came to the borders of old Europe. And here they saw this beautiful culture and meadows along the Danube in East Hungary, in Bulgaria, and Macedonia. And we have the first incursion of these half-nomadic people into Europe at the end of the 5th millennium BC. Since then, the troubles started. And this I call the first wave. But then about 600 or 700 years later, there was another wave. And then around 3000 or early 3rd millennium, the third wave. So we have now a transformation of the European culture from the matrilinear or matristic or matriarchal, if you like, to a patriarchal, patrilinear. It took a long time, and it was a gradual thing. It was in the beginning only East Central Europe, which was transformed. The western part of Europe, the Mediterranean part of Europe, was not touched at all until the 3rd millennium BC. Western part of Europe was still flourishing, the megaliths were built there, and so, although there are traces of Indo-Europeans even in Ireland in about the middle of the 4th millennium BC, but they had not much influence. So it is, I would say, a development of almost 2,000 years and dates from 4,300 to 2,800 BC. This is the period of the incursions of the people from the East. European culture is like a layer cake composed of the two very different ideologies, very different religions, very different social structures. And we are the heirs of the two cultures, not one. every European culture is a hybrid culture. And it is, to my belief, very wrong to think that the European agricultural culture, old European goddess culture, was Indo-European, as it was proposed by Colin Renfrew, my good colleague, in 1987 in his book, Archaeology and Language. This is a misunderstanding. The old European culture cannot be Indo-European because we can reconstruct the early Indo-European culture if we use linguistic evidence and mythology. And this is, my book, I think, shows that this is a non-Indo-European culture, an earth-loving, art-loving culture. The Indo-European culture is a completely different culture, representing a different ideology in every aspect of culture.
You've shown us several different goddesses, and I'm wondering, do you see this as one goddess with a number of different forms, or several goddesses who somehow are together representing natural forces and doing things in consort?
Yes, you have asked a very serious question, I would say, and it is difficult to say. Well, one thing is clear: there are many goddesses, there are many types of goddesses. It's clear from the very beginning, from at least the Upper Paleolithic, when we start to have the sculptures and also cave art. Now, is this one goddess with many functions, many postures? I would tend to say yes, and therefore I would like to call her the great goddess. However, maybe this answer is not for the whole of the history of humankind, because perhaps some of the images started in a different way. I would classify into two groups. The bird and snake could originate as totemic animals, and from the Upper Paleolithic or even earlier were serving as protectresses of the family and ensuring the life powers. And the other class would be this goddess who creates from herself. And therefore we have so many of her body parts represented. So these could be two lines which later merged, because later on we cannot distinguish very clearly between the bird goddess or snake goddess and the other goddesses and her functions. They are polyvalent symbols. And they are, for instance, the snake is the symbol of life power, and symbol of regeneration. And therefore their functions are here and are there. So it is almost impossible to say. But I only speak about the possibility of several images developing from one thought, the others from another.
Could you comment briefly on the ancient religions of other cultures around the world? And in particular, I'm curious if goddess worship is characteristic of a number of ancient religions.
Yes, certainly. The goddess religion was universal. In all parts of the world, we find the goddess before the patriarchal stage. And there are similarities between them, although I think if we want to decide